All right. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to our weekly Q&A. I'm TJ from Passend Education on a mission to make our gifted kids more happy, autonomous, and successful. And this week, I want to talk to you about mentors, which for us is kind of like a final stage of our entire school journey from all the way from year one up into A levels, where basically the kids really have to get into the trenches and fight for their lives while trying to get the scores that they want. And we find that particularly being a mentor is one, for me, it's very rewarding, but two, it's really, really important for the kids. And there's a bit of steps to it. So let me talk a bit about what a mentor is first. So the easiest way to frame the difference between the traditional teaching roles that we tend to know and love, like a teacher, a coach, and then finally a mentor, we have to sort of show what the difference is. So as far as I'm concerned, somebody who teaches, his main job is to get knowledge across. And that line starts to blur a little bit more and more nowadays, particularly in international schools. There's a lot of demand on teachers, but traditionally, teaching is a very one-way street kind of thing. The main goal still being transfer of particular knowledge. A coach, in a similar kind of fashion, takes skills, like very active skills, for it's often in sports, but technically in business we have coaches as well, where their job is to help really cheer on and focus on the actual skills that are needed in terms of repetition, learning how things work. A mentor, however, is a very different role. Right? Where a teacher tends to give answers and a coach tends to like spur you on. A mentor's job is more like a guidance and then somebody that gives that almost acts like a compass. And the way I used to or how I work with all my previous students as well as my colleagues when I was working in a games workshop, for example, has always been about this idea that as a mentor, your role is actually not to provide answers as such, but giving people the opportunity to really run into their own limitations in a safe and rewarding environment, as well as encourage them to look further than what people think they can do. Right. And really good teachers tend to shift between these kind of roles, but the role of an actual mentor, in particularly in gifted and talented education, takes a lot more predominant role in these kids' lives. And really, you often hear, maybe you remember yourself, like a certain teacher or a certain person in your life that basically had such a profound impact on you, and maybe that person didn't even say that much. Right? They didn't use that many words. And often when you hear people talk about like a really key mentor, that mentor wasn't there to give them answers as such, right? So but in our last stage, when we talk about gifted and talented and our philosophy, where we first have to make sure that people are happy, right? So are they mentally okay? Are they fully in charge of their own agency? Are they in charge of their responsibilities? Right. So that's the three things that we want to see when they're happy, and then we want to see them become autonomous, which basically is the act of learning particular skills that you need to what we call metacognition, like executive functioning skills. These are the things that you would need to basically help yourself build positive habits and building blocks that you'll see you through to the next stage. Now, when we get to the last stage, which is like success, which is quite broadly defined by us by lifelong learners, people with purpose, kids that basically know what they need, growth mindset thinking, really focused on reflection and so on. This is really where a mentor comes in. So as you can see, the roles of coaches and teachers tend to be towards these first two stages, and they mix around a bit. But a mentor is really where the success comes in. Right? So that is the key thing about a mentor is. Now, Bloom, from the famous Bloom's taxonomy, already in 1985 did a bit of research specifically towards talented kids and found that mentors played an immensely big role in their lives. He didn't really go that much further into that. There's been quite a lot of other works that he's been more famous for, but he already mentioned this in his works originally, that mentors are an important part. So that's how I define a mentor, as somebody that basically finds that guiding star and challenges kids to really like look at things through a different lens and work on themselves, right? So that's a mentor. Now, why should we look at mentors as gifted with gifted kids? Like, why is it so important for them? And a good framework to use is how we often describe the learning steps and stages of gifted kids and compare them against other kids and how they learn. Now, this line underneath here, time, you can also, if you want, you can replace it by age. And technically speaking, this crossroad where a lot of gifted kids start to struggle is normally around 14 to 16 years old. That's where we see this happen. But like honestly, this particular roadway is like quite dependent on the environment. There's lots of reasons why things work. So what then do we tend to see when it comes to learning with gifted kids? So initially, in their early years, they learn super quick, right? So the delta between learning against other kids versus themselves seems a lot higher, right? So and it makes sense because when it comes down to the age, right? If you're a very early walker, for example, you some kids can walk at half years old, and then the average kids tend to walk around like 12 to 14 months. Yeah, that means you're twice as fast. So you can see a big jump in what they learn quickly. But because they tend to get like quite comfortable at this stage, what we see is we see some plateauing, right? So they develop quickly, get some skills, they plateau, then they discover something else new like reading or math, and then they again go up, and then they plateau again, and the actual stages of this can be very varied. There could be quite a few, but what tends to happen is every time that plateau tends to get a little bit longer. Right? So they do need a bit of external guidance to get them to keep doing this. And meanwhile, normal kids or typical learners, they basically develop in a little bit. There's still a little bit of this zigzag as well, but it's easier, like harder to see. And they tend to go up, 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 and up and up, and they compound their learning as such. And at a certain age, what happens is the habits that they build up before from getting easy, quick success start to be overtaken by typical learners. And when that happens, the comparison that they start to make towards other kids and how all of a sudden strategies that used to work before don't work anymore become problematic. They start to often like fall behind. Now that's not always the case. Like if again with help of external factors like peer classes, we can basically help them keep going up. Right, basically look for enough challenge for them to keep enjoying the learning process. For the ones that we don't help, what we tend to see, like a huge chunk of them tend to like get like really stuck. Sometimes at a certain point they get over it, but most of the time then they relate their success to not the school or the people around them, but towards themselves, and they can get quite frustrated and angry with the situation around them. So one of the biggest things that I always think is a big danger for gifted kids is that they fall so out of love with learning through systems and universities and stuff that they don't want to go back to university. There's tons of really famous gifted individuals that have dropped out of school that prove this point. But even the ones that sometimes succeed don't want to go back. I have a lot of parents that are gifted as well, and when I ask them the question, "Do you want to go back and study?" they physically recoil. They get really frustrated. Right, so that's the thing that I want to try and avoid. Now, how do the kids deal with this though? Because unaided, there are certain strategies that kids build up that we tend to see that basically get them into a little bit of trouble. For example, right? These are the more common responses. There's quite a few other ones that we can talk about, but the ones that I run into most, that I think have the longest long-term detrimental effects on the kids' learning journeys, are the perfectionist and the serial starter. And these are by no means like unique to gifted kids only. But what we tend to see is that this happens more frequently and earlier with gifted kids than it happens to kids that are not gifted learners. So I still think it warrants saying that this is a gifted problem because it happens earlier with them. So the perfectionist, like what is basically going on? Like what all of these you have to see as ego responses. So the big problem is ego, right? So when we go back a little bit here, whenever we reach this stage, when they start seeing that the other kids are overtaking them, um, ego becomes a problem for them. Because when it comes down to ego, we don't like the way that we're wired is that we don't like to be challenged on our core beliefs. Our our entire mode of being on how we sorry my cat is screaming like crazy, um, so he's distracting me a little bit. Hope that's okay. But basically, whenever we run into a situation where our core beliefs are being challenged by situations around us, socially or academically, we are naturally inclined to try and protect our ego. And the way that we do that is by basically either fighting against whatever is causing this, so basically rebelling, or running away from it and hiding from it, or distracting from it. And that's kind of what these two strategies are, right? So they're distraction or avoidance behaviors that kids display to deal with that loss of that bruised ego. So the perfectionists, what they do is they realize, oh, I have built up some kind of advantage in some of my learning. Maybe I'm a little bit better at math, or I'm a little bit better at arts, or whatever that is, whatever they landed on. Traditionally, we could say there's like 8 different styles of learning that people can come into, and so that's the traditional Gardner learning styles, but they're learned, like they're learned behavior. So what we see is that these kids focus on one thing, and I call it spinning your wheels. So as long as you keep working on something, it is not finished, therefore it's not ready to be judged. Right? That this is one way to sort of avoid getting a judgment call on the fact that they've actually started running behind a little bit. So that's what perfectionists tend to do. Sometimes because they do work on something long enough, they still can perform quite well, and even to a certain point where they can build up enough mastery in a particular thing that they can become quite successful in life. But I've had some gifted adults that I've worked with where that were one of them is a lady who was extremely uh, gifted, like financial analysts, makes millions and millions of US dollars on a monthly basis, I believe. And at the same time, she was extremely, extremely scared to try anything else. Like, so she would use her perfectionism as a way to not deal with anything different. And it's basically the consequence of being that kind of person in school for a very, very long time. Now, that could have some positive effects. Like if you happen to be in the right kind of field, then you could still do financially well. But if you're a little bit unlucky and your field becomes really irrelevant, which in the day of AI today is obviously a problem that you could run into, it's a very high risk, high reward kind of return. So that's the perfectionist response. The second one is what we call the serial starter. And the serial starters are kids that learn that if I do something quickly, I can actually learn it very fast. So there's this little bunch of numbers where people say it takes you 10 hours to learn something, right? And it takes you about 1,000 hours to master something, and then it takes you 10,000 hours to become an expert, right? So what is really cool for gifted learner, and these numbers are arbitrary, like they could be 20, some people say it's like, oh, it's 100, like it doesn't really matter. Like the idea being that if you're a gifted learner, you learn faster than others because you can absorb more information, you can retain more information. So they often like drop a zero of these things, right? So in 1 to 2 hours, right, they can learn a skill. quite quickly. And a good example of this is learning how to speak a language, right? So they'll pick up an app and they learn German, and in 1 or 2 hours they can say 20 sentences, pronounce it pretty well because they can hear the tonation well. They remember these words, and for somebody that doesn't speak any word of German, it feels like, wow, here's somebody in an hour that learned how to speak German. Now, the next step would be then to say, okay, I'm going to take that German to the next level, and I'm going to become a master in it. But the jump from master to from learning something to master from the outside doesn't look that interesting, right? So if I'm completely oblivious to the fact that like German, like how German is spoken, and I see you've picked up German in an hour, and 4 weeks later you would still be learning German, because obviously you need like a bunch of months to make those hours work, unless you have nothing else to do. But it doesn't look like that person is progressing much, right? So if you're a gifted learner and you walk into somebody's living room and you say, yeah, I picked up German last week and I can speak this now, and everybody's, wow, this sounds great. If you come back to another party 2 months later and people say, how's your German going? You could say a few words, and for them it's like, yeah, it doesn't feel like anything different. But obviously for somebody who does master German, or is a native German speakers, they can definitely hear the difference between the two. But like that commitment is tough, and it is a lot easier to just go, you know what? Instead of like finishing going up the ladder for German, why don't I just pick up some Spanish? Like I spent another week, and now I can tell other people, look, I speak a bit of German and I speak a bit of Spanish, and then the week after that I can speak a bit of Japanese, and then maybe I can make a YouTube channel where I can go bother people on the street and pretend that I speak their languages because I'm dabbling in it. And it's like everybody goes, wow, that's amazing. But if you honestly, the majority of those guys, if you really talk to them, they don't speak anything to a master level, let alone an expert level. Right. So we call these kids the serial starters, and it doesn't, like, the example of a language is very obvious, but it can happen with lots of other subjects, you name it. And when you get to that point, like initially when you're basically in this stage and you're doing all these little jumps, it looks amazing. But eventually some of the other learners are going to overtake that basic level of mastery. And at that point, like, they can feel that gap. Like you can look at this graph for every different skill, those gaps get bigger and bigger and bigger, and they really can feel like they're being left behind. So that is the main problem that a lot of gifted kids run in. So when you have a gifted child that does all these kind of things, it can be very frustrating, because you can see that the mass of all the stuff that is like not finished projects or not finished learning skills, or like musical instruments that are no longer, that are gathering dust, like all these kind of things have financial consequences, frustration. But basically we tend to judge the kids when this happens, but really what is happening is like they're doing this as a defense mechanism against something else. And once you understand as a parent that actually this serial starting or the perfectionist is a defense mechanism, and we really need to help them with something else, then things become a bit more clear. So when you deal with kids, particularly from primary and then going to key stage 3, key stage 4, they're becoming teens, right? And teens going through puberty isn't really about like being the same person, just older. It's about becoming their own person. I often challenge parents to think about when was the last time they really listened to their parents, right? And the majority of the parents that I speak to will say in that 14 to 16-year-old gap. Some of them are a little bit later in this, particularly if parents were very, very strict. But a huge chunk of the very creative and assertive parents that are out there, they'll remember around the age of 16, they started to go, yeah, I'm not going to listen to everything my mom and dad say, right? Yet a lot of parents nowadays sort of expect their kids to keep listening to them until they're 21. And the question that I would ask, like the ones that succeed at that, often are left with kids that by the age of 21 have like not really much of an identity, right? So in our positive discipline courses, one of the first exercises you do is really think about what you want your kids to look like when they're 21 or 24 when they graduate. Like what kind of person, what kind of values do they have? How do they act? Like and when you ask parents like what you want your kids to be, they'll say they'll say at that point, yeah, I want them to be happy, I want them to be, you know, self-sufficient, and I want them to be successful, right? So like there's a lot of stuff where parents want their kids to be, but that gap in between is tough to deal with, right? So what do we do? And the another analogy that I really like to use is that technically at a certain stage you become more like a shepherd than an actual boss or the traditional parent, as people say. Right, so shepherds are very powerful people. They have influence on, particularly in the early stages, like what gets put into the herd as it is. Like, but you can't change the sheep. Like when you get a sheep in your pasture, the sheep is a sheep. What color coats they're going to grow, you have zero control over. Whether they're going to get sick or not, you have not all the control over. Right. So how they're going to act, you have no control over. However, you have a lot of control over where they graze and what kind of food they have access to. And as they get older and older, like you have an opportunity to shave them and things like that too. You could argue like, but the analogy falls a bit apart at that stage. But like as a shepherd, you have a lot of control of the environment, but not on the sheep itself, right? So having kids, having teens, is basically the same thing, right? So the very key stage in that development is the first 6 years. In those first 6 years, as parents, we have almost 100% of control over what the kids are doing. And as they get closer and closer to that 12 to 14, the actual impact you as a parent have directly on the kids' behaviors becomes less and less and less. There is still quite a few other things that you can do, and this is actually when the young adulthood bit starts to creep in. So when they start going to 17 all the way to 21, is like what you would like is for them to be able to select the right kind of guidance around them, to be able to find their path, right? So that should look more towards like trusted adults that you trust as a family, the child, you, your husband, your wife, your grandparents, like everybody should be there, like as a like trusting these particular people, so that the guidance the kids can get follows that same kind of values that you're hoping your kids will end up building towards, right? That you have as a kid. So that process can be scary because it means you have to let your kids go, you have to trust them, you have to support them. You again, I don't have 100% control over everything that is in there, and ironically, the harder you often try to control the small bits there, the more difficult you make it for the kids to become their own person, right? So this is where mentors are really important, and I think. One of the missed opportunities nowadays is that because of the internet and the way that we are connected, everything is sort of online. There's a lot less opportunity for kids to find their actual mentors, right? So we have to start thinking about what can we do as parents, as educators, to make sure that mentoring is an important thing here. And you don't have to look as a mentor as a male kind of role model, but there's a lot of female mentors that are really, really just equally important. The majority of my mentors were female, right? So like who you're looking for people with the right values. That's really, really important. Right. So what does that look like? So you've figured out that an actual mentor is presents itself in some form, and so what should you be looking for? What is the kind of person that is a good mentor? So the first one is mentors actually provide more challenge, and we've already seen that like one of the biggest reasons gifted kids struggle is because they're under challenged in almost all their academic life. And that builds up these bad coping mechanism habits to the point where eventually they become really self-destructive, potentially. So you start with challenge, and for those that are a bit more my generation, that have seen like Karate Kids, like whatever version of it, you can see how that kind of works. Like these are the Mr. Miyagi's and was it Mr. Chan? I think for the more recent one, are basically role models that model the right kind of behaviors, and present challenges in often unique kind of ways without any help at all. Particularly not to that moment, Mr. Miyagi moment happens where kids start realizing, oh, this is what we can do. All right. So the other thing that they do is they're normally really good at asking reflective questions. So if you can find role models that are very good at like listening and just asking good questions, that is something really, really important. And one of the other things that I would say a little bit late, that as parents, is that if you guys, it's hard to mentor your own kids, by the way, right? It has a lot to do with a lot of that journey to become like a teen, that adolescence part. There's a lot of stuff involved where there's a lot of resistance and frustration against authority, right? And because you are a very authoritarian kind of figure initially, no matter how loving you are like that particular, you have the authority. It's natural for them to want to rebel against that part, and that is why a lot of parents struggle with this. You will be able to really walk with them. So if you look at this particular picture, like as a parent, you should not really detach yourself from that at all. And what we tend to see is that kids that go through this successfully have closer bonds with their parents once they come out of that, adolescent stage, which, should give you a little bit of a feeling of, okay, there's a long range strategy here. Let's play the long game and see what we can do, right? So the reflection part is important, but the last thing is really about direction. And one of the reasons why this is so important is that you have to imagine that the challenges that the kids are running into when it comes to this, the way to deal with ego, they're mostly related to dopamine deficiency. So the work that needs to be done to basically bridge these gaps, to bridge this gap, requires a lot of willpower. And in order for somebody to be really good and really disciplined, because that's kind of the thing that we want to see when we talk about autonomy, somebody who's disciplined, um, you have to basically work on that a lot. And that means trying to make as many positive behaviors recur as often as possible till they become subconscious habits. When you get that, when you've managed to achieve that, everything becomes easier. And that's like, there's books like Atomic Habits for those that haven't, that basically says, how can I get these particular habits to form? One way I explain it is almost like a little bit of computer code that you have to keep writing, and as long as you keep writing one line, eventually it becomes like a subroutine that runs itself. But where things get difficult is like discipline. The actual word discipline comes from the Latin word disciple, which is technically a student, but disciples is often a word we tend to use for students that are really, really dedicated and study under a very trusted mentor or master. Right. So that's where the original word comes from. So somebody that is disciplined is a student that basically follows their master in or teacher or mentor in this case, like methodically, to the point that they become masters of the things that they're trying to learn themselves. So that's what discipline really is all about. It's always about learning things. So there's an interesting little fact about where that word comes from. So that direction is more important for gifted kids than it is for typical learners, because the willpower needed for them is higher, because the perceived gap is higher, but also their threshold for getting bored and understimulated is very high as well. And the coping mechanisms, all the procrastination, all the other things, are direct consequences of them basically being bored more quickly, and their dopamine systems also being really quick at learning bad behavior. So one of the advantages gifted kids have is that they can learn behavior subconsciously very, very quickly. But that goes, if those behaviors are the wrong ones, then it can lead to a really strong downward spiral. So what they need to really get over that is like really strong purpose. And when almost all the works, if you talk like Van Tassel Baksa, QnA, they all say that one key defining thing of gifted individuals is that they have real strong need for higher purpose. And I believe that that has a lot to do with the fact that basically that disconnect between the willpower that they need to be able to learn the skills that they observe that they need. And yeah, again, a mentor is so important in this, because in that way, it's like the goal is not to remove obstacles at all. It is to help them grow through them. And that means taking step backs on occasion, right? Like we've spoken a lot about emotional development and how it's like a muscle you have to build. And when it comes down to challenge is normally something related to fear, which means they can either fight or they can flight, right? Important here that like a mentor does not replace a parent. Like there is still, particularly in these younger stages, an element of safety and proper adherence to norms that have to be followed. So there is a role for parents in this, in terms of what is allowed and what isn't allowed and what you want to do. But the idea being is that like you need somebody who's not in an authority position to help your kids go through a lot of this stuff, right? So what is the power of social capital? Like a lot of times people talk about like it's not about who you know, sorry, not about what you know, but who you know. And I think when it comes down to it, this is part of that. And some people could say that a big chunk of this is nepotism. And I heard somebody phrase that as like nepotism is a skill to develop as well, which is kind of interesting, because if you look at like how important like the group of people around certain individuals, like the importance of those people around them are, it's really interesting to see how a lot of them cling to particular mentors, role models, different kind of places, right? So in a child's life, coaches, teachers, and mentors are really, really, really important. And this is where that pasture analogy comes in, because a lot of these, of course, the coaches and the teachers, and even in some cases the mentors, although like mentors in the Netherlands are actually part of normal schools. Right, so I'll go into that a little bit more deeply in a second. But in Malaysia in particular, mentors are not part of it. We have what we call safeguarding parts of schools. So there's pastoral, some schools call it slightly different. Their roles are generally around dealing with behaviors that weren't desirable. So they can tend to be kind of negative. There is like classes that they do to try and be positive, but there's no like positive discussion beforehand. What we do in the Netherlands is very, very different. We don't have a pastoral in the same sense that we have it here. What we have is mentor classes. So every teacher in the school is assigned initially a bunch of mentor kids, and they're directed to have a meeting with these kids, like a couple of hours for every term, and they have to happen before the end of a term. And in those mentor hours, they have to talk with the kids about positive and potentially like other things that happen. And so a lot of the mentor kids will, once that relationship is strong enough, will actually tell the mentors like, hey, you know, like I'm being abused at home, or like, and this is where normally pastoral comes into play as well, when kids start to like not working well in our international schools here in Malaysia. So we do notice it, but it tends to be like something has already broken at that point. Whereas with the mentor programs, the discussions tend to be a lot more upfront, and you, honestly, in majority of my mentor classes that I or like classes that I do with the individual kids, a lot of them start talking very openly about how things are going at home. And what is really important for me and for all my teachers is that when we engage with the kids and talk about this stuff, is that the aim is not to be counter parents or anything else. It's always about trying to repair a situation, or and to me, the sense of belonging that we want to see in Maslow's hierarchy, that is a really important part of being, happy, right? So being responsible for your family's well-being in that sense is actually really empowering to the kids. So I'm hoping always that whenever we have these conversations with the kids, is that like we can get them to re-engage with parents. And we've had some kids that have started to do reading sessions with the parents, or meetings with the parents that they initiated. In a lot of these sessions, we talked about family meetings, we talked about like shared experiences, like eating together and so on. And it's good as parents to try and encourage that as habits as early as possible. But there is an option for some of the kids to come to you as a parent and go, actually, mom, I want to have a meeting. I've had a mom said the other day, it's like, actually, my son is he gets frustrated and upset when we don't have time for the family meeting. He insists we have to do it. So there's a lot of stuff here that as mentors we should be able to help the kids come back with the parents. And in that too, grandparents are actually very, very important as well. What I do like about like when I'm here in Malaysia is that like grandparents often are very, very close to the family. Like some of them living in the same houses and things like that, which I think is really good. In the Netherlands, we have something called Grandpa and Grandma Day. It is very common for kids in the Netherlands to sleep one night a week with their grandparents. So that means 2 days a week, the kids sleep with their grandparents, which means parents get like 2 days of peace and quiet. And what is really interesting about like the family dynamic on how kids in tribes are often raised is that kids tend to spend quite a number of hours, like maybe 4 to 6 hours a day, not with their parents in tribes. So they're passed around, and you see a remnants of this. Like I happened to go to a wedding in Penang the other day. My sister-in-law was getting married. It's like 200, like Chinese wedding, 200 people there, and we brought my new infant there, and I didn't see my infant the whole night. He got passed around every table, which was actually really nice, because that's something that I've noticed in some parts of the West doesn't happen often enough. And I think like that particular part of the Malaysian culture is still alive, but it does feel like it's a little bit on life support, because it only tends to happen, from my experience, with these big parties. And what we should be trying to do is like, what could we do to engineer our kids taking a little bit of time with other kids? So effectively, mentoring can start earlier in this. There might be a particular family member that people do work towards. And of course, one of the things we have to mention is that one of the reasons this happens less and less is because a lot of people are very scared about like safeguarding principles and all the other stuff that's all there, which is why it's so important that you have to have a really good relationship with the people around you. And you also have to talk to your kids, particularly about what are proper safeguarding conversations. So I think having that conversation with your kids is like, what is appropriate, what isn't, is quite important. But again, like you need to have a good relationship with your kids to be able to do this. So so there we go. But grandparents, of course, can be a really, really important part in this. And if you want a little bit more peace and quiet, throw your kids to your grandparents once in a while, and you probably get a little bit more energy to deal with a lot of the other stuff you have to deal with, right? So now, what is very interesting when it comes to mentoring is that like there's two studies that I could find, because like actually the Raposa study I've read earlier before, but I managed to refine it, where they did quite a lot of this particular study, Raposa. They looked at 25,000 kids and what kind of mentoring they've had, and they really saw massive improvements, anywhere up to like 0.4% increase in actual like academic success. And the way that the graphs looked was kind of cool. Is that if you have like, particularly for gifted kids, if you have like a bell curve of success, so like you have a few people that are successful here. If you have gifted and talented programs, you can actually like increase this bell curve a little bit like this. And if you have a mentor program on top of that, like that's kind of how the curve works. So the impact on mentoring is they had like a 15 to 20% more likeliness to complete a subject under a mentor. And that's not the same as a tutor. Like, let's be very clear. Like a tutor's role is a lot more like a teacher most of the time. Although some really good tutors actually are really good mentors. So again, who you find together with your kids is really important. But it's that staying engaged, the success that they get academically, and it actually continues into adulthood. What was very interesting as well is that they saw that the increase was actually highest in college, right? So I think the actual graph looked a bit like this, where the impact, the positive impact, was like 5 to 10% in high school. So if this is high school, then we had like during a bachelor, it was a little bit higher, like actually somewhere here, I think. And then there was like, sorry, this is more like I think it's undergraduate, then bachelor. Master actually went up a little bit, and then when you did your doctorate, it went down. But like obviously, there's less people doing doctorates, and there was a little bit of contention about this. But yeah, so the impact was actually biggest in a master, and if you're doing like A levels or undergraduate, like kind of things. And I can see in our programs when we start working with the A-level kids how much of an impact that has on them. It's quite it's for me very rewarding, because the kind of work I do with these kids, like I had one this morning that like said, yeah, I didn't want to study anymore because what's the point? And this particular boy is extremely good at making apps and doing things on the computer, and he says, I want to be a game developer. And I had to like talk like through him, like help himself reflect on like what skills he's missing to be like a really good game developer. And at the end of the conversation, he's like, oh man, like I get it now. Like, oh, I understand like all this frustration about like studying, like why there's a point to it. Like I get it. And then he basically left early and said, okay, I'm ready to get started again. So like those kind of conversations are for me very rewarding, because you can see somebody that has given up go like, okay, I'm going to continue. But I know for a fact that if he takes that to heart for the next week for his last couple of exams, then he will use that in other places. Now, why is that important here for you as parents when it comes to like how can I support my kids? Like the skill of finding a mentor is actually not that easy, right? So you have to open up quite a lot about what you want, or like particularly you have to be quite vulnerable around what you're willing to receive as feedback, right? So if we only start talking to them about like, you have to go find a mentor, like they're probably somewhere in a university, they're further away from home. Their support structures aren't there, so we find that a lot of students struggle to find mentors, and this is particularly true for women. Now, that's really a big challenge for women to find good mentors around them. So I think it's important you start that process early, so that they are better at making value judgments on who model the right kind of behaviors and so on. All right, so the last thing here is like they grow through relationships is really, really important, because modeling behavior like is so much more important than you think. If you really want to have an impact on your kids, you don't want them to be as angry and stuff. You have to probably look at like, okay, am I the one being angry? a parent says, "Yeah, my kid swears all the time," and then we asked the kid as well, but it's the parents like, "Yeah, but who does swear all the time?" So yeah, actually, dad's probably the one that needs a little bit of help with that. So like modeling is important, and I always joke that like if you as a parent want a change in your kid, you need to tell them 4 times. If I, as a teacher, in my teacher role, have to tell kids something, they'll listen like 2 or 3 times. But in peer classes, they listen like once or twice. But I find that once that mentorship relationship is established, I say something once, and they take it like very quickly, which is obviously a lot of power that I have to use correctly, but it's also very rewarding for me. So what should you do? Like, what is the last bit that I want to give to you here before I open things up to questions? So if you guys have any questions, by all means, put them in the chat. So the famous saying, "It takes a village to raise a child," which is getting harder and harder and harder to do, because like internet is not a replacement for a village, as far as I'm concerned. For one, none of the body language, none of the other stuff that normally is supposed to be there to see like how people behave around others, like cannot be modeled online as easily. So that's really important. It tends to be a very one-way kind of thing, right? So like all that on its own is also something that is difficult. So what I would suggest when it comes down to it is try to help your kids build that surrounding thing around you, right? So let's sorry, I'm trying to rejoin with something here so that I can see what the questions are in the chat. There we go. There we go. None yet. Please leave something behind. So what are the 5 things you can do to help with this? Well, first of all, we have to build that emotional safety. You have to help your kids become very confident in speaking to people, particularly adults, right? Like again, like a mentor sits in that weird space, which is not a peer. So they're not trying to compete. Like in peers, there's a bit of competition, particularly when they're in the teenage years, right? There's no authority. So teachers, coaches, parents, they have an authority figure, whereas a mentor is like they normally have no direct correlation to their grades or anything else like that. Which is one of the other reasons why in our gifted and talented programs we don't have grades, because putting grades in and making a reward-based system means that we're putting ourselves in an authority position, and then we cannot help them, right? So, but in order for all of that to land, we need to make sure that they're emotionally safe. Can they take feedback? Are they able to regulate their emotions when things get hard, when a mentor throws something difficult in front of them? And this starts at early as 6 years old, but even if they're older now, you can still work on this, which is all about letting them vent if they need to, letting them like calm down, helping them, not judging, very important, and rewarding positive behaviors. In a similar manner, like building a positive self-identity, like the moment you start focusing on things that are the outcome, you're making things do or die, which means people can fail. And that means there's fear involved. And whenever there's fear involved, there's a chance that some of the kids might not do things. Whereas if the focus is on what are you doing, what are the things that you've done that have been successful for you or that gave you good feelings, the idea that they can then try and fail at things is really good. So you have to welcome your own feedback. This is one of those things when it comes to modeling, like a lot of people around us are terrible at receiving feedback. I'll grant you, a lot of people are terrible at giving feedback as well, right? So that is definitely there. But in true Stoic fashion, you cannot control how people tell you things. You can control how you respond to things. So the biggest thing here, and this is kind of what we're telling the kids to learn, you as a parent, you can learn this too. When somebody gives you feedback and it makes you upset, That's okay. You can be upset with getting feedback. How you respond to it, that is technically more under your control. Now you have to practice this. Sometimes you don't have to agree with what feedback people give you, but like you should always thank people for feedback that you give. It's an extra point of reference and data that you can have. So you have to model this yourself. So one question I ask parents often is, do your kids tell you that they don't like something, and how do you respond? And if you get upset with them, then maybe that's something to work on, right? Then the next thing, finish things. Now, finish things here is important that what you do is you let them do big projects, right? Now, we do this in our classes all the time, but ideally, we want to encourage the kids to start their own projects and things like that. Now, we never give homework, but we will not stop kids from taking things home. And what I'm starting to see is more and more of the kids wanting to do more stuff at home, bringing stuff in, and that is one of those things. Like, what are these big projects that have no judgment on them that they are trying to complete? Now, for the ones that don't know, like, there's a lot of Warhammer and board games behind me. So toy soldiers are an amazing hobby in this, because it's very easy to see when something's finished or something is not. Like a lot of like small versions of that. Like, you take a model, you paint it. There's other collectible things. There's hobbies are a great part in this. Um, I have to say that when it comes down to it, too few of our kids have hobbies. Way too few. And no, computer gaming is not, I don't count that as a hobby. That's kind of a pastime. So things that need you to learn a skill on your own, that like need to require you to do some research on it. So some gaming has a little bit of an element of that. That's why it's a little bit tricky. But most games that kids engage with are just pastime. So like we have to be a bit mindful of that. But big projects slash hobbies are really good, right? So can you encourage this? And again, the best way to do that is to model it. Like, what is your hobby? Like, what is something you make time for? And then the finding trusted adults, like this is obviously Malaysia being quite a religious country still. There's places in the community where you can find individuals that are probably aligned with your values. That really helps. There's clubs, there is other places, going to social events. Like, it's starting to, like, a lot of us don't like to go to big parties anymore. COVID has done a big number on us with this, but missing out on those things is actually quite detrimental to our kids. Right. So, what are the things that you can do in here, either by modeling it yourself or to facilitate it for your kids, so that they can find the people that they need to help them overcome their challenges, their barriers, and then become more rounded adults. Right. And that is at the end stage of our program. If this goes well, I hope that years from now, I will still get some of the kids, then full grown adults, to come back and ask for questions, or mentor, my kids. That would be awesome. Like, I have a bunch of young kids too. Right? So if we can find a way for this particular like community around gifted individuals to become a little bit more close knit, around the right kind of values and ethics that we need, and really a love for learning again, then I'm pretty sure we'll have some really, really successful individuals at the end of all of that. So with all that, I would like to say thank you for tonight. I hope you guys learn a little bit more about mentors and our mentor program that is for some of you to come. Oh, so build a positive identity, right? So can I elaborate a little bit more on this? Yeah. Um, like, this is the works from Carol Dweck mindset are really good at this. So I would say um, there's lots of versions of this. Like, what is your self-image? Like, what do you look at? Like, who are you? And I think mindset for Carol Dweck is has like quite a binary kind of version of this. So I would say you have growth mindset, which is the idea that like you are what you are because of the effort and work you put into learning things, and the rewards that we should give as parents is on the effort. We ignore the actual outcome of things. The opposite of this is closed mindset or fixed mindset. And it's the idea that I'm a smart person, right? So I'm smart, I'm born smart. I've done an IQ test, so therefore I'm a gifted individual. And that's my identity. Now, the reason why that identity is very dangerous is because there's no real incentive in trying harder new things if you believe you've already proven that you're smart. Like the only thing you can do is show other people that, oh, okay, I might get a lower grade. This is particularly bad if you've scored straight A's all the time, right? So if you've always scored straight A's, then at some point, there's testing can only prove that things are worse. It's one of the main reasons why grades are technically a bad thing. And so that is that positive identity about okay, what kind of person are you? Are you a value-driven person or are you a results-driven person? Because the growth mindset looks at values, about perseverance, not giving up, trying new things, and so on. And the way that you can encourage that with the kids, and you have actually quite a lot of influence on this as parents, even if they're in their teenage years. And that is by, and this is hard, whenever they do something amazing, do not acknowledge it at all and really, really just focus on the efforts that they took to do anything. Even if they fail at something, the efforts is the important part. Because if they go, ooh, okay, I didn't get what I wanted, but like I still got like a little bit of a dopamine hit from just attempting, from just doing it, they're going to try harder next time. And Carl Dweck's work shows that the impact on that is like 10 points on their IQ, like and for years to come, right? So that is a very important positive identity, ignoring the bad behaviors and working on. If you want to know more about this, positive discipline, the courses that Fatiha is running for the parents, basically build on all of this. Like that, the idea that you're trying to help kids feel heard and seen and basically listened to, right? So I hope that answers your question, Eslin. Great. Okay. Well, thanks for that question. Very good. Um, I'm going to wrap it up because it's 9 o'clock at night, and you're all going to probably need all your energy to deal with your gifted kids tomorrow. So thank you very much for joining us. This video will be on our YouTube channel if you want to see it. If you do want to share it with any of us, I'm looking forward to seeing all of you at the upcoming uh, entrepreneur stalls. There's some amazing projects that are being done by a lot of the kids. It's really fun to see like what margins they manage to work with and stuff like that. So yeah, looking forward to seeing you guys there, and then of course at the camp that is coming up too. So again, thank you very much for coming in. If you have more questions, put them in the questionnaire, and I wish you all a very good night. All right, thanks everybody.